Speaking as someone who has spent much more than my share of time trying to go to government agencies and say, the law says you must do this and you can't do this. Why are you reversing that? And then finding out that, no, we're right, you're wrong. And the last line of defense are attorneys who are willing to take on the government, which has an unlimited legal budget, namely our tax dollars, and fight for what the law and the Constitution actually say. And thank God that many of these people are out there and they exist and they are fighting the good fight and very often winning. Thank you very much. I was just noticing another wonderful example of what we're getting to in a story this morning. In the great state of Florida, there was a series of very well-coordinated SWAT raids, full body armor, drawn weapons, where they raided a number of institutions, African American and Hispanic, where the proprietors were suspected of the second-degree misdemeanor of practicing as barbers without a proper license. Okay. Moving on to our second speaker. Georgi Boorman is a blogger and researcher from Seattle, Washington. He is originally from Fox Island, where she was homeschooled before entering college at 16. Got tired of staying at home, I guess. Moved to Seattle, earned a BA in cultural anthropology, from the University of Washington. She has just since joined the private sector and works full-time at a startup in the heart of Seattle, where she manages company policy and industry compliance. She is a regular contributor to the Federalist and writes on a wide range of cultural issues. Please join me in welcoming this woman.
Not a Mac either, so give me a second. Technical assistance. Okay, I know those buttons. I know those ones. Okay, so there we go. Can everybody hear me now? Okay. I guess this takes practice. I hope you enjoy my PowerPoint. I worked pretty hard on it. I fetched some pretty pictures for you, mostly so that you don't have to look at me, you can look at the pictures. Today I am going to be talking about countering mass transit with culture in the context of Seattle, where I'm from. And when you're on the right and living in a really liberal city like I do, the political environment can be really fatiguing. It gets to the point where you start hearing yourself say things like, it's just too tough here. No one cares about politics, much less urban planning, much less light rail. You know, you have the facts on your side, but it feels like pop culture is really just stacked against you. And how can facts alone defeat the cultural influence of the left? How do we successfully counter those efforts? Asking fellow residents in Seattle to vote against a light rail package is like asking for a burger at a Chick-fil-A restaurant. At least that's how it feels. But there are ways to counter poor urban planning and mass transit with culture and influence members of the community that you might now consider unreachable. As Breitbart said, politics is downstream from culture. There's a flow, a path of least resistance from culture to politics, and then to policy, ultimately. And it's difficult to disrupt and alter, but it is doable. So if you just have a little bit of context here, here's just a very, very brief overview. There we go. Brief overview of Seattle's transit sustainability planning. It's called their Climate Action Plan. It involves tolling or road pricing, the development of transit-oriented communities, which includes tripling the bicycle ridership by 2017 from 2007 levels, a 20% reduction in vehicle miles traveled by 2030, which I think is very ambitious, and of course more dedicated bus lines for Sound Transit and King County Metro. But then here's really the bottom line. This is the kicker, and this is the ultimate goal: to make walking, bicycling, and transit the easiest ways to get around. The easiest ways to get around. Key phrase there. I just want to give you an example of this mindset. CentralLink. It was the most expensive light rail in U.S. history when it was built. But actually what I think is more important in this example is the fact that they tried to ban parking within a quarter mile of the stations. They actually tried to do this, and they thought it would be successful. And Rick Sheridan, the spokesperson for the Seattle Department of Transportation, said light rail was meant to be fed by people taking the bus, walking, or biking. No cars. So, that being said, if you are of the opposing mindset and you think that that is just a little bit ridiculous, hopefully you'll get something out of the rest of this discussion. But if we're going to talk about countering with culture, there are a few things that we should recognize before we paddle out into open water, into that stream, so to speak. One is that culture is messy and often contradictory and incoherent. Sometimes we broad brush entire communities and try and fit them into one sort of ideological box and think of them as having a uniform set of beliefs and principles, but that isn't really the case. In any cultural environment, there are inherent contradictions. There are forces, ideas, and narratives that push and pull in different directions. Not everybody believes the same thing. Imagine what a world that would be. That would be horrible. But these inherent contradictions and incoherencies can be exploited. And we can re-emphasize different parts of the cultural dialogue. It is easy to broad brush, though, almost convenient to focus only on extreme ideological groups or only on policy, planning, and bureaucracy. Those things are really important. For instance, if you're from Denver and you think of Seattle politics, you probably think of the $15 minimum wage. I think most people do. That made a lot of headlines. It's really extreme. It's really radical. And that's kind of how this idea comes about of, oh my gosh, Seattle's such a radical city. And there are definitely some radicals there. But you kind of get my point. Not everybody is like that. So we could consistently rail on the extremists. We could call them names. We could declare they're ridiculous to the world, all things which I have done and will probably continue to do. Or we could have a comprehensive approach to fighting mass transit in which we build a cultural influence that rivals that of the left without necessarily seeming adversarial or contrarian. As I said, policy and research is really, really important, but we can't begin to turn the tide of smart growth and other failed sustainability ideas without broader public support. We need the public on our side. We need to make cultural waves so powerful that we can affect politics and ultimately policy downstream. So once we recognize that culture is messy and inconsistent, we can begin to re-emphasize the cultural dialogue. One of the cultural themes you'll see running throughout the rest of my presentation, this discussion, is innovation. Why? Because innovation is of significant value to Seattleites, especially technological innovation. They're really keen, we are really keen on embracing the next big thing and on being a 21st century city. Yes, there's a substantial amount of car shaming and environmental self-righteousness that goes on. That's definitely there, but we can't forget the other aspects that we on the right, or anybody who loves freedom and mobility, can appreciate. And this is what I mean by taking advantage of contradictions and re-emphasizing the dialogue, re-emphasizing innovation instead of some of those other things. I do not believe that every Democrat is a Luddite, despite the reputation the far left lends to that party. I choose to think a little bit better of them. They do appreciate the innovation that companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Boeing bring to their city, not just the jobs they provide. I've put together a few of the innovators in the Seattle area for you. More pictures. But I think the ride-sharing and car-sharing services operating in Seattle and many other places provide a window into this aspect of culture that we on the right so often neglect. Here's a quick snapshot of the main players in what you might call new transit, or that's what I call it. They're pretty popular in Seattle, and actually in just under 4 years, ride-sharing services have expanded to cover roughly half the nation's population, so that's popularity. And for those of us on the right who are in cities that lean left, I think these innovators remind us that good ideas can be popular enough for common citizens in the city to stand up against local government for. In July, city residents actually gathered enough petitions to put the council's cap on the number of drivers a ride-sharing company can have in the city up to a vote in November. I'm sure you guys have all heard about that cap as well. And the council actually caved to that pressure and they rolled it back. So that was a big win, supported by everyday people, not just people like us who come to conferences like this, but people across the political spectrum who saw this as inconvenient and detrimental to mobility and just plain unfair. So that's what's going on in the private sector. Let's move very briefly to the public sector here. The big question that I don't hear anybody asking right now is about public transit is why aren't people clamoring to have government provide subsidized ride-sharing services or taxis? I mean, if you've heard anybody ask this question, please let me know because I would love to look into it. The obvious answer on the policy side is that the left only wants mass transit, moving lots of people at the same time in the same direction, not private transit. But what is the answer on the public opinion side? In other words, what makes buses different? So let's set aside light rail for just a minute, since buses are the bulk of public transit. What makes them different? Well, the difference is in perception. People have been conditioned to think of public transit as a public service because it has been for their entire lives. That's the foundation on which public transit and its sizable portion of the municipal budgets is maintained. Then what shores up that foundation is how the left continually reinforces the idea that public transit is how we take care of the poor. It's how we look after low-income families. So most of us don't really know any different. If taxis had always been a public service and we'd subsidize those, we'd perceive them as being a necessary function of local government too. But there's nothing inherent in buses that makes them by nature a public service. This perception can be changed though. Just look at how not too long ago many people saw NASA as being a really important government endeavor. But now we're starting to see that perception fall away just a little bit as new innovators in the industry like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic come into the industry and start proving their stuff. And also a similar thing with other countries who have denationalized their airlines. So in fact, it's not that huge of a leap. We already have successful interurban lines. But we don't hear anybody clamoring to have them socialized or subsidized by the state. Perhaps part of that is because they aren't used so much for commuting. But nevertheless, it's still a very similar service to bus travel within the city. The success of these lines actually in the long run could threaten intercity light rails, which makes me very happy. Okay, by now I'm sure you've guessed where I'm going with this. And you're going to call me crazy probably, but I think the best chance we have at making waves in the culture is to go big and go on the offense. Even in really liberal cities like Seattle, a full-blown privatization campaign. I know you're probably thinking, where did Randall find this person? She's crazy. Just hear me out. Part of the appeal of this is going to come through innovation, technological and logistical improvements to city bus transit that the public sector simply can't provide. What about privatizing, or what about private company partnerships like Starbucks being able to locate inside bus stations? I would really like to wait for my pumpkin spice latte while I'm waiting for my bus. I think that that would be the best thing ever. Or onboard refreshments like a lot of buses in Turkey have, or Wi-Fi like a lot of vehicles already have that capability, or maybe extra security for some of those more dangerous nighttime routes. I actually spoke to one person in the bus station who told me that on one route at night she actually had her necklace ripped straight off of her sitting on the bus. So buses can be innovative and profitable. How do I know? Because even light rail was shown to be profitable at one time in the private sector. Back up all the way to 1962, back in time when the Seattle Center monorail opened for the World's Fair. When I first started researching the monorail, I actually thought at first that it had been built by the city of Seattle, but it was not built by the city of Seattle. It was built by a private German company called Alweg, who pioneered the technology of running the same train back and forth on the same rail, hence the term monorail. It actually took less than a year to build it, and by the end of the fair, the German company Alweg had already turned a profit. Today, it's pretty much one of the only rails in America that's self-sustaining, largely because it's a tourist attraction. Actually, I think it's the only one. But my point here isn't new. The private sector innovates, while the public sector can lag sometimes decades behind. This is what we should be emphasizing, not the superiority of the private sector, but simply the benefits that it could bring to the industry. Privatization has the potential to bring into transit the kinds of innovation we've seen in other industries. The issue remains, however, how do we turn potentiality into reality amid this push for transit sustainability planning and light rail? I believe that our current approach in the area, as I mentioned before, isn't making as strong a cultural effort as we are policy efforts. The truth, though, is that the nitty-gritty of policy making is extremely impactful, but it's not very interesting to the majority of citizens. They're not analyzing the data like the researchers and drawing conclusions. They're just going about their daily lives. Transit policy is by no stretch of the imagination a hot-button issue. So I would argue that the first challenge we face in fighting sustainability planning is not sustainability planning itself. It's getting people interested in something that isn't in important ideas, real change that isn't yet part of the local or national dialogue. So how do you affect cultural change if the change we're trying to make is on a topic that no one is particularly interested in, emotionally or mentally invested in? In other words, how do we make the boring unboring? This is what I call, the pet rock principle. And that is, you can make virtually anything interesting, even rocks, anything interesting if you associate it with the right things and present it in the right way and solicit the right kind of emotion. So when you look at this cute picture, for instance, you don't really see a handful of rocks. You see a clever cultural reference and a humorous pun. Same basic principle, pet rock. Historically, the right has been pretty bad at propaganda. I don't mean misinformation campaigns, which is what the term sometimes implies, but I just mean propagating a message in an effective and enticing manner. So we were talking about, sorry, I just keep clicking through. We were talking about the all-wig monorail just a moment ago. I just want you to listen to this excerpt from one of the brochures during the 1962 World's Fair. I'll just read the first paragraph because I'm running out of time. The two slim right rails, narrowing in unison toward infinity, skim over the noise and the clutter of street traffic. Four cars tandem bend into the curve above Stewart Street, and ahead is the straightaway, a mile of unswerving concrete beam. The driver accelerates, and four electric motors suck in power, 20 miles an hour, 40, 60, 70. Down the other monorail, the second train appears and speeds forward, then swishes past in an amazingly quiet rush. Okay, so if you were in 1962 after reading that, wouldn't you want to ride the monorail? You'd be just a little bit inspired, right? I would. I mean, the last time I read something like this about transportation from a libertarian perspective, a freedom-loving perspective, was in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. It's been a really long time. A really long time. Though occasionally, I must say that Top Gear, their scripts occasionally come pretty close. Okay, speaking of Top Gear, I am wrapping it up, I promise. You know that we can inspire people with beautiful language, though it doesn't have to be as beautiful or poetic as that. But what's perhaps even more effective is making people laugh and just engaging them in pop culture. I'm actually surprised at how few pro-private transit people have picked up on the fact that Top Gear is a really brilliant aid for our cause. Because it doesn't just talk about the latest cars, it explores cultural issues involved in transportation, and all the core concepts are there. Individualism, markets, innovation. Those are all there. And Top Gear doesn't have a blatant political agenda like a lot of other pop culture shows, which is important. You'll see a lot of memes out there that mock light rail and mock the chronic problems with buses. And those are really entertaining and important for motivating people, but they're transparently partisan. And blatant partisan attacks, for the majority of us, are a turnoff. Instead, we need to get down into that cultural stream like I was talking about before, into the dialogue, and propagate good ideas in an attractive and effective manner. So I know you guys are going to laugh at this because it's really cheesy, but I'm not a graphics designer, so just bear with me. Here's an example of what a pro-privatization poster could look like. If I were a graphics designer, I would actually make it look a lot better than that. I would make it look shiny and futuristic and new and cutting edge. Kind of like that. That's a bullet train. I'm pretty sure that's computer generated. But you get my point. This is the kind of imagery that the left uses, and it's very effective, especially for people who want to be on board with what the next big technological thing is. And want to keep moving through the 21st century in Seattle. I feel like they need to do that. So, another tactic we can borrow from the left, though, is tying low priority, low brain space issues to larger issues that people care about. Global warming may not be on the top of the nation's agenda, but it is nevertheless alarming to a lot of people when brought to the forefront. That's what progressives have done with transportation. They've associated transit planning with saving the planet. It's really quite ingenious when you think about it. So what issues can we tie transit to? It can't be scare tactics, as we've seen with the 15 Now campaign. That doesn't work. Drastic job losses and closing businesses haven't stuck with Seattleites. So the meme of public transit as being a great economic burden just won't fly. But people do care about fairness and the well-being of others. There we go. And I actually think that poverty and the welfare of the public are probably the most ideal for the Seattle area, at least. I would love to talk more about this, but I am running out of time.
Thank you very much.
All right. So I just want to talk to you. Just to wrap it up here. My last point about countering with culture is about fitting into the narrative. In liberal metropolitan areas, some of us have to fight our conservative instincts and embrace the narrative of progress. I believe placing private transit within the larger narrative of progress is a way to pull transit out from behind the closed doors of policymakers and into the casual political dialogue. Okay? as one of many ways we can move the country and the city forward toward prosperity. This doesn't mean we pretend to adopt extreme opposite views. What it means is that progress is a malleable term, okay? And different ideological groups have different ideas on what that means. So here's how I've laid it out. There are some concepts that are so vague that you can't possibly disagree with them, like hope and change, but on closer inspection they mean different things to different people. Sustainability is like that, where when you really look at it, it does mean different things to different people, but it is a pivotal point on that road toward progress, and it can be exploited, as can the word progress itself. So here's how I see it. There are essentially two paths that the public can take, and they can either push into one path or be pushed into another. Do you want to live in a city that lets you spend your money on the transit that works for you, or one where subsidized light rail eats up an ever-increasing portion of taxes and never reaches operational levels? Do you want to see more innovation like car-to-go and Uber, or a more effective bus system, or do you want to have those choices ripped away from you in a city of perpetual traffic congestion, where the easiest way to get around is by bicycle or streetcar? Which is more sustainable? And let me just leave you with this. The city that offers choices to its residents, or one that forces everyone into the same mode of transportation. Is that the sort of community you want? Proponents of freedom and mobility cannot be afraid to use the same language as the left, to not just build a counterculture, but to counter within the culture, within the narrative. So that being said, let's make 2014 the year that we all stood for innovation. Thank you.